My name is Joan Fletcher. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described using the same words: steady, sensible, dependable. I'm a wife, a working professional, the kind of woman people trust with responsibility because I don't make things messy. I show up, I follow through, I don't demand to be noticed. From the outside, my life looked calm, stable, predictable in a reassuring way. People often assumed that meant I didn't need much, that I was emotionally self-sufficient, low maintenance, unbothered by small disappointments. When you don't complain, people decide for you that nothing hurts. I've learned that quiet women are often misunderstood. Our restraint gets mistaken for acceptance. Our patience gets read as infinite. Our silence becomes a convenient place for others to put their negligence and call it normal. I'm sharing this story not because something dramatic exploded, but because something subtle finally settled. This is not a story about rage or retaliation. There's no screaming confrontation, no public unraveling, no moment where someone storms out and slams a door. It's about recognition, about the point where you stop negotiating with yourself to keep the peace. At its simplest, the moment that started, everything sounds almost trivial. My spouse forgot our anniversary, but remembered his ex's birthday. People hear that and assume jealousy, or insecurity, or overreaction. I would have thought the same once. But context matters. Patterns matter more. And what mattered most was that I found the reminder on his phone, not by searching for evidence, not out of suspicion, but by accident. A small discovery that quietly rearranged everything I thought I understood. This story unfolds slowly because real emotional shifts usually do. It begins with invisibility, the kind that doesn't announce itself as pain, but accumulates quietly in the background of your life. Then comes awareness, not anger, not confrontation, just a clear internal acknowledgement that something fundamental has been uneven for a long time. What follows is not revenge, and it's not drama. It's restraint. It's choosing not to perform the reaction people expect from you. It's learning when silence is no longer avoidance, but intention. When stepping back isn't weakness, but positioning. I'm not here to villainize my spouse. I don't believe in turning complex people into caricatures. I don't believe in rewriting history to make myself the hero. I believe in accountability without spectacle, and consequences that don't need to be announced to be permanent. If you're looking for explosive moments, this story may feel understated. But if you've ever been the person everyone relies on while quietly overlooking, if you've ever been so consistent that your presence became invisible, this may resonate more than you expect. As you listen, I invite you to reflect on something gently, without judgment or urgency. How long can you be understanding before understanding costs you your sense of self? I didn't realize how clearly people had defined me until I stopped fitting the definition. To most people in my life, I was the reliable one, the organizer, the woman who remembered birthdays, coordinated holidays, kept the calendar balanced, and filled the gaps others didn't even notice were there. I was the person you leaned on without asking whether I was already carrying too much. Not because anyone was cruel, but because I made it look easy. In my marriage, this role settled in quietly. I handled the logistics without being asked. I noticed when groceries were low, when bills were due, when emotional tension needed smoothing over. I learned the rhythms of my spouse's moods better than he ever tried to learn mine. Not out of fear, out of habit, out of a belief that care was something you demonstrated, not requested. To him, I think I represented stability, predictability, a constant, and constants, by their nature, fade into the background. You don't thank gravity for keeping you grounded. You only notice it when something drops. When people described me, they used phrases like low maintenance and easygoing. They said I was strong, which often meant I didn't require attention when I was hurt. They said I was understanding, which translated into me absorbing discomfort so others didn't have to feel it. And I accepted that framing for a long time, because it came with a quiet pride. I liked being competent. I liked being trusted. I liked knowing that if something went wrong, I could fix it without drama. What I didn't realize was how often that competence was used as permission to forget me. In social settings, I was rarely centered. Conversations flowed around me, not through me. Decisions were made with the assumption that I would adapt. If plans changed, no one checked whether they worked for me. I would figure it out, and I did. Every time. In my marriage, this invisibility wasn't overt. There were no insults, no explosive fights, just a gradual narrowing of space. My needs were acknowledged abstractly but postponed indefinitely. Later became a placeholder for things that never quite arrived. I told myself this was maturity, that real relationships weren't about keeping score, that love meant flexibility. And for a long time, that belief felt virtuous, noble even. But there's a difference between flexibility and erasure. I didn't feel unloved in obvious ways. I felt assumed to be okay, assumed to be fine, assumed to continue exactly as I had been, no matter how uneven the emotional exchange became. What hurt most wasn't neglect, it was predictability. The certainty that if something required extra effort, emotional presence, or memory, I would be the one compensating. And that this compensation was so reliable, it no longer registered as effort to anyone else. I didn't voice this out loud, not because I was afraid, but because I couldn't find the right language yet. How do you explain that nothing is wrong, but something is deeply imbalanced? So I stayed quiet. I fulfilled my role well. I smiled at the right moments. I minimized my disappointment until it felt almost theoretical. And from the outside, everything looked intact. But invisibility doesn't announce itself as pain. It shows up as a slow dimming, a sense that your presence is functional rather than cherished, that you are appreciated for what you provide, not for who you are when you stop providing. At the time, I didn't know this was the beginning of a shift. I thought this was just adulthood, just marriage, just the quiet trade-offs people make. I didn't yet understand that being underestimated isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's a role you're cast into because you never challenged the script. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic enough to deserve its own memory. At least, that's what I told myself at the time. It was small, ordinary, the kind of thing people brush past without stopping. That's usually how the most instructive moments arrive. It happened on a Tuesday evening, months before our anniversary. I remember because Tuesdays were quiet, no social obligations, no performances, just the rhythm of the house settling into itself. I had mentioned, casually, that my work presentation had gone well. Not fishing for praise, just sharing something that mattered to me. He nodded, smiled briefly, then returned to his phone. There was no malice in it, no dismissive comment, just the subtle signal that my words didn't require follow-up, that they were informational, not connective. I felt something close in my chest, then open again as I let it go. I told myself he was tired, distracted, that I didn't need affirmation to know my own worth. That was the first small cut, not because he didn't respond perfectly, but because I noticed how quickly I moved to protect him from the possibility that he should have. From that point on, moments like that began to stack, not in a way that felt alarming, but in a way that felt patterned. I would mention something personal, a concern, a hope, a small fear, and the response would be polite, brief, and incomplete. No questions, no curiosity, just enough acknowledgement to close the subject. Other people didn't notice. Why would they? Nothing overt was happening. We were cordial, functional, pleasant even. If anything, we looked like one of those couples people describe as solid, and I contributed to that image. I smoothed transitions, I redirected conversations away from awkward pauses. I filled the silence with reassurance. I had become very good at buffering emotional gaps so no one had to feel them. I remember once asking gently if he could let me know earlier when plans changed. Not as an accusation, just a request. He apologized, promised to do better, and for a week he did. Then things returned to normal. That was another small cut, the kind that doesn't bleed but leaves tenderness behind. I told myself consistency was hard. Those habits take time. That intention mattered more than execution. What I didn't acknowledge was how often my intentions were assumed to be permanent, while his were treated as aspirational. There was a dinner with friends where he interrupted me mid-sentence. Not sharply, just seamlessly, like my words had reached a natural conclusion in his mind. I stopped speaking without comment. No one reacted. The conversation moved on. I laughed it off later, but something stayed with me, not the interruption itself, but how easily my voice had disappeared from the room. The cuts weren't cruel. They were efficient, small enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a map. A quiet lesson about where I ranked in the hierarchy of attention. I began to notice how often I was expected to adjust, how rarely anyone adjusted for me, how praise for my strength seemed to increase in direct proportion to how much I swallowed. Still, I said nothing, because saying something would require framing these moments as real, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. Naming an imbalance forces you to decide what to do about it, and I wasn't prepared to disrupt the structure I had helped maintain. So I did what I had always done. I internalized, I rationalized, I waited. The thing about small cuts is that they don't demand immediate action. They give you time. Time to doubt yourself. Time to normalize what should feel wrong. Time to convince yourself that noticing is the same as overreacting. But memory is patient, and once you start remembering, you don't stop. There's a particular danger in situations that never quite cross the line. When nothing is egregious, you start adjusting your definition of what's acceptable, quietly, incrementally, until one day you realize the line moved, and you were the one who carried it. By the time the small cuts became familiar, I had learned how to soften them. I explained things away before they could harden into meaning. I told myself relationships went through phases, that attentiveness ebbed and flowed, that emotional steadiness meant not reacting to every fluctuation. And so I adapted. I stopped expecting follow-up questions. I learned to compress my stories into efficient summaries. I shared achievements in ways that didn't invite engagement because I already knew what the response would be. I made it easier to acknowledge. This wasn't something I consciously decided. It happened the way posture changes do, gradually, in response to pressure. You don't notice you're slouching until your back starts to ache. When he forgot small details about me, preferences I'd mentioned more than once, plans we'd discussed recently, I smiled and reminded him, lightly, without edge. I treated memory lapses like weather events, neutral, unintentional, not worth interpreting. If he remembered details about other people, coworkers, old friends, people from his past, I told myself that was normal too. Some facts just stick better than others. That comparison was unfair. What I didn't ask myself was why my details were always the ones that slipped. I became efficient at minimizing my own disappointment. I reframed neglect as a distraction, absence as busyness. I took pride in being understanding, even when understanding required me to shrink. At social gatherings, I watched how people leaned in when he spoke, how his stories were met with interest, with laughter, with questions. When I spoke, responses were polite but brief, and instead of feeling resentment, I adjusted my delivery. Shorter sentences, less vulnerability, fewer pauses that might invite interruption. I was teaching people how to treat me without realizing it. The more I accommodated, the more normalized the imbalance became. If I handled everything smoothly, there was no friction to indicate something was wrong, no feedback loop that required correction, and so the narrative solidified. Joan is fine. Joan doesn't need much. Joan doesn't mind. Joan understands. I repeated that narrative myself because questioning it felt destabilizing. If I admitted something was wrong, I would have to confront how long it had been happening and how complicit I'd been in maintaining it. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when I was sick with the flu. Not seriously, but enough to be slowed, dulled, vulnerable. He asked what I needed. I said rest. He nodded, then proceeded with his day as planned. I ordered my own soup, refreshed my own water, canceled my own commitments. Later, when I mentioned feeling disappointed, he seemed genuinely surprised. "You didn't say you needed help," he said, and I believed him. That was the most dangerous part. Not his response, but how reasonable it sounded. How quickly I accepted the framing that if something wasn't explicitly requested, it was an ode. I had spent years anticipating needs, filling gaps without being asked, and somehow that effort had been reclassified as optional the moment I stopped providing it. So I adjusted again. I started articulating needs more clearly. But even then, I softened them. I packaged them with reassurance. I made sure my requests didn't feel like burdens. And when they were forgotten, delayed, or half met, I told myself at least I had tried. What I didn't see yet was how often trying became evidence against me. Proof that I could handle disappointment without consequence. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as comfort. The comfort of knowing someone will absorb the impact so you don't have to. By normalizing that role, I made myself predictable. And predictability, in relationships, is often mistaken for permanence. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't planning anything. I was simply becoming quieter. Not because I had less to say, but because saying it felt increasingly unnecessary. And in that quiet, something else was forming. Not rage. Recognition. Roles don't arrive with announcements. No one sits you down and explains what's expected of you. They emerge through repetition, through what gets rewarded and what gets ignored, through what causes friction and what keeps things smooth. By the time I recognized my role, I had been performing it for years. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed the inconvenience so it didn't ripple outward. If something went wrong, I corrected it quietly. If someone forgot, I remembered. If tension appeared, I diffused it. I had become the emotional infrastructure of our shared life, essential, unnoticed, and rarely acknowledged unless it failed. In my marriage, this role felt almost invisible because it was never questioned. Plans were made with the assumption that I would adjust. Decisions were framed as joint, but the labor of making them work fell to me, not because I was forced, but because I had always made it look effortless. I noticed how often we actually meant me. We should schedule that. We need to remember this. We will handle it. And I did. When I brought up imbalance, it was reframed as miscommunication, or timing, or stress. Each explanation was plausible enough to accept, especially because accepting it allowed everything to continue without disruption. But gradually, I saw the structure beneath the explanations. I was expected to be reliable, not reflective, useful, not central, appreciated in theory, but not prioritized in practice. My emotional steadiness had become part of the furniture, something you rely on without thinking about who maintains it. And the more consistently I fulfilled that role, the more fixed it became. What startled me wasn't that others had assigned this role. It was that I had helped define it. Every time I minimized my disappointment, every time I reassured instead of clarified, every time I chose harmony over honesty, I reinforced the expectation that I would always be fine. I wasn't punished for speaking up. I was simply ignored in subtle ways that made speaking up feel inefficient. There was a moment when this realization crystallized. We were discussing a future plan. Something important to me. Something I had mentioned several times. He nodded as I spoke, agreed in principle, then moved on to another topic without addressing any specifics. Later, when I followed up, he said, "I thought you were just thinking out loud." That sentence landed heavily, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed how my words had been categorized as optional, as abstract, as something that didn't require action. I realized then that my presence had been redefined. I wasn't a participant in shaping our shared life. I was the person who adapted to the shape others created. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I began to notice how often my emotional labor was invisible because it was successful. Problems didn't escalate because I intervened early. Disappointments didn't linger because I processed them alone. The system worked because I made it work. But systems like that don't thank you. They rely on you until you stop. I didn't confront him. I didn't demand a redefinition of roles. At that point, I wasn't angry, I was observant. I started asking myself different questions. Not why this was happening, but how it had been allowed to continue. Not what he should change, but what I had been silently agreeing to. Because roles persist only when they're accepted. And acceptance, I was beginning to realize, isn't always a conscious choice. Sometimes it's just the path of least resistance. I was still performing, still reliable, still calm. But internally something had shifted. I no longer saw my role as natural or inevitable. I saw it as constructed. And constructions can be altered, not through confrontation, but through the withdrawal of consent. The shift didn't happen on our anniversary. It didn't happen when I found the reminder on his phone. Those moments mattered, but they weren't the beginning. The real change happened earlier, on a day so quiet it almost disappeared. It was a Sunday morning, No plans, no urgency. The house was still, the kind of stillness that usually felt comforting to me. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my planner open, not scheduling, just looking. Pages filled with commitments, notes, and reminders. A written record of how much I carried without comment. He walked past, coffee in hand, scrolling through his phone. I asked a simple question, something logistical. He answered without looking up. That was it. That was the moment. Not because of the response, but because of what happened inside me. For the first time, I didn't soften the feeling that rose up. I didn't explain it away. I didn't rush to understand him. I let the discomfort exist without managing it. And in that stillness, I noticed something startling. I was tired. Not physically, existentially. Tired of anticipating. Tired of translating my needs into something palatable. Tired of being the emotional adult in every room. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was almost clinical. Like noticing a long-standing injury you'd learned to work around had finally limited your range of motion. I closed my planner and sat there longer than usual. I didn't cry. I didn't rehearse a speech. I didn't feel anger surge. What I felt was clarity. I saw my life as it was, not as I had been narrating it to myself. I saw how often my contributions were assumed rather than appreciated. How my emotional restraint had become a convenience. How the absence of conflict had been mistaken for the presence of balance. And I saw my own role in sustaining it. There was grief in that clarity. Not grief for the relationship as it was, but for the version of myself who believed endurance was the same as love. That morning, I didn't say anything different. I didn't act differently. But internally, something fundamental shifted. I stopped compensating emotionally. I didn't preemptively reassure him. I didn't smooth the edges of silence. I let pauses linger. Not to punish, but to observe. And what I observed was instructive. Without my usual emotional scaffolding, interactions felt thinner, less polished. Small gaps appeared, gaps I had been filling for years without realizing it. And no one rushed to fill them. That told me everything. I realized then that confrontation wasn't the answer. Not yet. Naming a problem before you fully understand its structure only invites premature resolution. I didn't want a temporary improvement. I wanted the truth. So I decided to watch, not passively, but attentively. I began to note patterns without reacting to them. How often my needs were deferred. How often his attention flowed outward, but not inward. How rarely curiosity was extended toward me unless I initiated it. This wasn't bitterness, it was data collection. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for gathering it. That day marked the end of something I hadn't known I was participating in. Emotional self-erasure. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become cold. I simply stopped overfunctioning. And in that subtle change, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not relief because I had a plan, but because I had stopped lying to myself about what was happening. The shift wasn't about him. It was about me choosing to remain present to my own experience instead of editing it for the comfort of others. I went to bed that night with a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. Not hopeful, not defeated, just awake. After that Sunday, my silence changed texture. Before it had been reflexive, an automatic smoothing of edges, a way to keep things running without interruption. Now it was deliberate, not performative, not punitive, simply chosen. I spoke when I had something to say. I stopped filling space just to prevent discomfort. When conversations ended early, I let them end. When plans were vague, I didn't clarify them unless they affected me directly. I stopped anticipating questions that were never asked. What surprised me was how quickly this new quiet was misread. He didn't ask as if something was wrong. He didn't notice a shift in my energy. He interpreted my calm withdrawal as ease, as proof that everything was fine. In his mind, nothing had changed, because nothing had demanded his attention. That in itself was information. Silence, I learned, only alarms people when they're accustomed to being engaged. When your role has been to stabilize rather than participate, your absence of effort doesn't register as loss. It registers as efficiency. So I watched how often emotional labor went unreciprocated, how often our conversations centered on his concerns, how often my internal world went unexplored because I no longer offered it up unprompted. And I noticed something else. Without my constant calibration, small misunderstandings surfaced. Not conflicts, just gaps, forgotten details, missed cues, moments where he could have checked in but didn't. I didn't correct them. This wasn't manipulation, it was honesty. I was no longer editing reality to make it smoother. I realized that for years I had been buffering the relationship from its own imbalances, and by doing so, I had delayed any opportunity for those imbalances to be seen. Silence, when chosen consciously, is a form of truth. People often think speaking up is the only way to assert themselves. But in systems that rely on your unspoken labor, withdrawal speaks louder than words. Still, I didn't rush. I didn't escalate. I didn't change my tone or demeanor. I remained kind, present, polite. What changed was my availability. I stopped being emotionally on call. When he spoke, I listened, but I didn't overinterpret. I didn't offer solutions unless asked. I didn't translate his feelings into something manageable for him. And in that space, I felt my own boundaries solidify, not as walls, but as edges. The silence gave me room to hear myself, to notice when something didn't sit right, to let disappointment land without immediately neutralizing it. It also gave me clarity about what wasn't being asked of me anymore, because it had always been assumed. No one asked how I was feeling about things. No one noticed the reduction in my effort. The machine kept running, slower perhaps, but still functional. That's when I understood something critical. My silence was not a threat to the relationship. My presence had been. Not my emotional presence, but my compensatory one. As long as I filled every gap, nothing had to change. As soon as I stopped, the gaps became visible, but only to me. And that was enough. I wasn't waiting for him to notice. I wasn't hoping for an apology or an awakening. I was learning what happened when I stopped performing my role. What emerged wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Silence, when it becomes a choice, stops being a burden. It becomes a tool, not to control others, but to reclaim yourself. What people rarely understand about quiet people is that silence doesn't mean stillness. While nothing appeared to be happening on the surface, something very deliberate was unfolding underneath. I wasn't withdrawing from life, I was preparing. Not in a dramatic way. There were no secret folders labeled with intentions. No late-night confrontations rehearsed in my head. What I did instead was begin to observe with precision, and to document, mentally at first, then concretely. I started with patterns, not moments. Moments can be explained away. Patterns tell the truth. I noticed how often responsibilities defaulted to me without discussion. How financial planning was treated as a joint concept, but an individual execution. How emotional maintenance was invisible unless it failed. So I began tracking things, not to build a case, but to understand the system I was in. I reviewed our finances carefully, not out of suspicion, but out of self-respect. I wanted to know what I was standing on. I made sure I understood every account, every obligation, every shared responsibility. Knowledge, I realized, was the opposite of panic. At work, I sharpened skills I had let plateau. Not because anyone pushed me, but because I had stopped assuming stability was guaranteed. I took on projects that expanded my autonomy. I updated the records. I made myself professionally undeniable. Not for leverage, but for confidence. At home, I stopped rescuing. If something was forgotten, I let it be forgotten. If a task was overlooked, I didn't silently absorb it. I watched how often inconvenience landed where it always had, and no one commented. That was the most telling part. My reduced effort didn't register as an absence. It registered as normal, which meant my previous effort had been excess, unacknowledged and unreciprocated. I began to document, not obsessively, not with drama, but accurately. Dates, conversations, decisions, not for confrontation, but for clarity. Memory can soften things over time. Records do not. I also began to learn, quietly. I read about emotional labor, not in a way that made me angry, but in a way that named what I had been doing for years. I learned how often women like me mistake endurance for love, and how systems quietly reward that mistake. None of this was fueled by resentment. It was fueled by respect for myself. What they never noticed was how calm I was becoming. Not numb, not detached, grounded. The less I overfunctioned, the more energy I had. The more I conserved my emotional output, the clearer my thinking became. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't change my routines dramatically. I simply became less available in the ways that had cost me the most. And because I had never been loud, my quiet went unquestioned. That invisibility, once a weakness, became an advantage. I saw how much of the relationship's stability depended on my unseen labor, and I realized something crucial. Stability that relies on one person's self-erasure is not stability. It's a delay. This wasn't about preparing to leave. Not yet. It was about preparing to choose. Choice requires information. It requires capacity. It requires knowing that no matter what happens, you can stand on your own feet without scrambling. I wasn't building an exit. I was building integrity. And what they never noticed was that while I remained kind, consistent, and calm, I had stopped being dependent on being understood. Understanding, I learned, is not something you wait for from people who benefit from misunderstanding you. It's something you give yourself first. By the time the next shift came, I was ready. Not because I knew what I would do, but because I trusted myself to do it without chaos. Quiet preparation doesn't announce itself, but it changes everything. I didn't go looking for the truth. That's important to say because people often assume discovery comes from suspicion or desperation. It didn't. It came from routine. From one of those ordinary moments you don't mark until later, when you realize it quietly split your life into before and after. It was late afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen counter with his phone beside me, charging. Mine was dead, and I needed to check the date for a work deadline. We shared access to everything: devices, accounts, passwords. Transparency had never been an issue, or so I thought. When the screen lit up, I didn't intend to scroll. A notification banner simply appeared. A reminder. Not urgent, not hidden, just a soft alert scheduled for the following week. Don't forget her birthday. No name, no heart emoji, just familiarity. I stared at it longer than I expected to. Long enough for my body to react before my mind did. A quiet tightening in my chest. A pause that felt like gravity had shifted slightly to the left. I tapped the reminder. That's when I saw the pattern. It wasn't new. It wasn't accidental. It had been recurring for years. Same date, same wording, same quiet diligence. A digital ritual kept alive with consistency and intention. His ex's birthday. I didn't feel anger. Not even betrayal in the cinematic sense people expect. What I felt was something colder and far more clarifying. Precision. Because this wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't a distraction. This was prioritization. And in that moment, something aligned. I thought of our anniversary, the way it had slipped past with an offhand apology. There was a mild surprise when I mentioned it later. The explanation about being busy, about days blending together. I thought of how often I was told not to read into things, and I understood then that I hadn't been reading too much. I had been reading accurately, and then choosing not to trust myself. I put the phone down carefully, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I respected the moment too much to rush it. This was not ammunition. It was confirmation. I didn't confront him. I didn't screenshot anything. I didn't spiral into old messages or timelines. I didn't need more information. The clarity was already complete. What mattered wasn't the X. What mattered was the asymmetry of care. Effort is never neutral. People remember what they decide is important. They plan for what they don't want to forget. And they excuse lapses only when they don't cost them anything. Don't cost. I sat there for a long time, letting the realization settle fully into my body. No panic, no shaking hands, just a deep, quiet knowing. This wasn't a single oversight. It was a mirror. I finally saw the relationship not as I had hoped it was, or defended it to be, but as it actually functioned. And strangely, that realization brought peace. Because uncertainty is exhausting. Self-doubt corrodes. But truth, even when it hurts, simplifies. I knew then that nothing I said in that moment would matter. Any confrontation would shift the focus to damage control, not accountability. Explanations would arrive quickly. Justifications would sound reasonable. And I would be tempted, once again, to smooth the edges. I wasn't interested in that anymore. This was a private reveal, not a public reckoning. It told me what I needed to know about where I stood, about how much effort was being invested, and where. And more importantly, it told me that my silence, my restraint, my patience had not been misunderstood. They had been relied upon. I didn't feel small. I felt clear. I closed the calendar app, unplugged the phone, and went back to my day. I cooked dinner, I answered emails, I spoke normally. But internally, the last question I had been avoiding finally answered itself. I wasn't imagining things, and now that I knew that, I didn't need to rush. Clarity doesn't demand speed. It demands integrity. There's a moment after clarity arrives when nothing happens externally, but everything becomes irreversible internally. That's the space I entered after the private reveal. I didn't feel compelled to act right away. In fact, urgency felt like the wrong response. Urgency belongs to panic, and I wasn't panicking. I was evaluating. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider options I had previously dismissed as unthinkable, not because they were extreme, but because they disrupted the identity I had built around endurance. I asked myself questions I had avoided for years. Can this be fixed? But should it be? Not, how do I explain how I feel? But why should I have to explain something this consistent? I laid the choices out calmly. I could confront him immediately. Name the reminder. Ask for an explanation. Seek reassurance. That path was familiar. I could already predict the outcome. Regret expressed, context offered, promises made, temporary improvement, eventual regression. I could ignore what I'd seen and continue as before, armed now with quiet resentment disguised as patience. That option felt corrosive. I knew what it would cost me. Or I could choose something else entirely. Not revenge, not drama. Alignment. I could stop trying to restore a balance that had never truly existed. I could make decisions based not on preserving the relationship at all costs, but on preserving my integrity. That choice didn't announce itself with emotion. It arrived with stillness. I realized that whatever I did next would be irreversible, not because of legal or logistical consequences, but because I could no longer unknow what I knew. Once you see clearly, pretending becomes a form of self-betrayal. I thought about timing, about preparation, about what kind of ending, if there was to be one, would reflect who I actually was, not who I'd been trained to be. I didn't want chaos. I didn't want to be reactive. I didn't want to burn anything down just to prove a point. I wanted coherence, so I chose the option that required the most discipline. I chose not to speak yet. I chose to move from observation into intention. That decision point wasn't about leaving. It was about no longer negotiating with myself, about refusing to explain away what was now undeniable. I decided that whatever came next would be grounded, quiet, and complete. No ultimatums, no emotional bargaining, no pleas for awareness. I would act in ways that didn't require permission. This wasn't a punishment for him. It was an alignment with myself. The strange thing about that decision was how calm it made me. Not relieved, not empowered in a dramatic sense. Settled. I slept deeply that night. The kind of sleep that comes when your mind stops rehearsing alternative realities. Because the decision wasn't what I would do. It was how I would do it. And once that was clear, the rest became a matter of execution. Quietly, once the decision was made, my life didn't change outwardly. That was intentional. People expect turning points to announce themselves, to come with visible shifts, sudden distance, or emotional signals that something is wrong. I offered none of that. I moved the way I always had, calmly, competently, without spectacle. But the direction had changed. I began to take care of things I had postponed under the assumption of permanence. Not in secret, but without commentary. I separated preparation from performance. I reviewed legal documents I hadn't looked at in years, not because I anticipated a specific outcome, but because I wanted to understand the framework I was standing in. Knowledge, again, was grounding. There's a particular calm that comes from knowing where the edges are. I made sure my financial accounts were clear, organized, and accessible. I ensured my income streams were documented accurately. I updated the records. I created an order where I had once relied on trust alone. This wasn't distrust. It was adulthood. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't ask permission. I didn't dramatize it as self-protection. I treated it as what it was: responsible autonomy. At the same time, I became more selective with my energy. I stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate last-minute changes. I didn't cancel my plans to support him. I didn't volunteer emotional labor without being asked. When I declined, I did so politely, without explanation, without defensiveness. No became a complete sentence, not because I wanted to assert power, but because I no longer felt obligated to justify my boundaries. And still no one noticed. That was the most telling part. The structure of our life was so accustomed to my flexibility that my refusal to bend was interpreted as circumstance, not choice. The machine continued to run, powered by momentum. I also began to reclaim parts of myself that had gone dormant. Interests I'd minimized because they weren't efficient. Social connections I'd neglected because they required effort. I was always saving for a home. I didn't announce my return to myself. I simply returned. At home, I remained kind. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become distant or cold. I was simply present in a different way, less anticipatory, less explanatory. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't volunteer answers. This was not avoidance, it was alignment. There's a misconception that moving in silence means being deceptive. In my experience, it's the opposite. It's refusing to perform emotions you no longer feel or justify decisions you've already made internally. I wasn't hiding. I just wasn't narrating. And in that quiet execution, I felt something solidify inside me, a sense of authorship over my own life. I was no longer waiting to see how things would unfold. I was participating in their direction. The absence of reaction from him wasn't painful anymore. It was instructive. It confirmed what clarity had already shown me. Attention flows where intention lives. And his intention was elsewhere. That knowledge no longer destabilized me. It anchored me. By the time subtle consequences began to surface, I was already steady. Not braced, not guarded. Ready. Consequences rarely arrive as punishments. More often, they show up as absences, things no longer done, spaces no longer filled, supports quietly withdrawn. That's how they began for us. At first, nothing was named, but small disruptions started appearing in the rhythm of our lives. Tasks went unfinished. Dates were misremembered. Plans felt less smooth, less coordinated. Not dramatically so, just enough to be felt. He mentioned feeling off, tired, disorganized. He said work had been chaotic lately. Those things didn't feel as balanced as they used to. I listened. I didn't offer solutions. For years, I would have stepped in immediately, reorganized schedules, anticipated stress points, absorbed the overflow. This time, I didn't. Not out of spite, out of honesty. I had stopped compensating for the imbalance. The emotional temperature in the house didn't spike. There were no fights, but a subtle friction emerged. The kind that comes from systems no longer being invisibly maintained. He started asking questions, casual ones at first. Did we talk about this already? Do you remember where we put, I thought you were handling? Each time I answered calmly. Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I said no. Sometimes I said, I'm not sure. And I didn't rush to resolve the uncertainty. The shift unsettled him, not because he felt accused, but because he felt unsupported in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Something familiar was missing, and he didn't yet know what it was. That's the thing about unseen labor. Its absence feels like loss, even if its presence was never acknowledged. He became more restless, less grounded. I noticed how often he seemed surprised by minor inconveniences, things I used to intercept before they surfaced. He mentioned once, half joking, "You've been kind of quiet lately." I smiled and said, "I feel fine," which was true. The consequences weren't loud. They were cumulative. Without my emotional buffering, conversations stalled sooner. Without my anticipation, small responsibilities landed where they belonged. Without my reassurance, uncertainty lingered. He began to feel the weight of things he had never noticed were being carried. But he didn't connect it to me. That too was telling. It wasn't that he missed me. Not yet. He missed the ease, the smoothness, the invisible hand that made life feel manageable. And because I wasn't performing distress, there was no obvious problem to fix. That's what made the consequences so effective. They weren't confrontational. They weren't framed as lessons. They were simply reality, unedited. I remained consistent. I didn't oscillate between warmth and distance. I didn't send mixed signals. I was steady in a new way. Self-contained, grounded, uninterested in managing outcomes. And slowly he began to feel it. Not to blame. As an imbalance, he became more attentive. Not to me, but to the disruption. He tried to restore equilibrium without understanding what had changed. He asked if something was wrong. I said no, because nothing was wrong. Something was simply no longer being hidden. The consequences had begun not because I wanted them to, but because I had stopped preventing them. And once that process starts, it doesn't reverse itself through intention alone. The moment he realized something was wrong didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with confusion. He began trying to compensate, not consciously at first. He'd ask if I needed anything. He'd check in more often. Small gestures appeared, slightly out of rhythm, like someone learning a language after years of hearing it, but never speaking it. I noticed. Of course I did. But noticing and responding are different things. For a long time, I had trained myself to meet effort halfway, even when it arrived later inconsistently. This time, I didn't rush to bridge the gap. I observed whether the effort could sustain itself without prompting. It couldn't. He'd be attentive for a day, maybe 2. Then things would slip back into familiar patterns. Not because he didn't care, but because care without awareness is fragile. Eventually, the confusion turned into unease. "Have I done something?" he asked one evening. The question was sincere and deeply revealing. It framed the issue as an event rather than a pattern, a mistake rather than a structure, something sudden rather than something cumulative. I told him no, because in that moment the answer mattered less than the realization that we were operating on different timelines. He was looking for a recent trigger. I was responding to years of erosion. By the time concern showed up, I was already elsewhere internally, not checked out, but complete. He tried to talk more, to reconnect, but his attempts were reactive. They appeared in response to discomfort, not insight, and I could feel the difference. What he was trying to fix was the feeling of losing equilibrium, not the reason equilibrium had always depended on me. And that's when I understood. Timing is not neutral. Repair requires proximity to the damage. When effort arrives too late, it doesn't feel like care. It feels like maintenance. I wasn't angry. I wasn't closed. But I was no longer persuadable. There's a point where explaining yourself stops being communication and starts being negotiation against your own clarity. I had passed that point quietly. He began to panic, not outwardly, but in subtle ways. He'd linger longer in rooms, ask more questions, look for cues he used to ignore. And still, the core imbalance remained unaddressed, because it wasn't about doing more. It was about seeing differently. And seeing differently can't be rushed. By the time he wanted to understand, I no longer needed him to. That's the cruelty of delayed awareness. It arrives when the other person has already done the emotional work alone. I felt compassion for him, truly. But compassion doesn't override truth. The attempts to fix things came too late, not because I was unwilling, but because they were responding to consequences, not causes. And relationships don't survive on reaction alone. They survive on mutual presence. That presence had been uneven for too long. The conversation happened on a weekday evening. No build-up, no announcement. Just the quiet accumulation of unsaid things finally reached a point where silence no longer served either of us. We were sitting across from each other, the house calm in the way it gets when both people know something is coming, but don't name it yet. He spoke first. His voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It carried something closer to fear. "Can you tell me what's going on?" he asked. "I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't understand why." I looked at him carefully before answering. Not to calculate impact, not to soften the truth, but to make sure I spoke from clarity, not exhaustion. "I'm not disappearing," I said. "I'm just not compensating anymore." He frowned, not in anger but confusion, so I continued slowly. For a long time, I filled in the gaps, emotionally, logistically, relationally. I did it quietly, because I thought that was what stability looked like. But somewhere along the way, that became the expectation instead of the exception. He tried to interrupt, to explain, to reassure. I held up my hand gently, not to silence him, but to keep the conversation from slipping into familiar patterns. "I'm not listing grievances," I said. "I'm describing a structure." I told him about the invisibility, about being remembered only when I stopped remembering for both of us, about how effort directed elsewhere had been precise, intentional, while effort toward me had been assumed unnecessary. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't mention the reminder yet, and that calm unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He said he hadn't meant to hurt me, that he loved me, that he didn't realize how things had felt from my side. "I believe you," I said, and I did. "But intention doesn't undo pattern," I continued. "An awareness that arrives after consequence isn't repair. It's response." That's when I told him about the anniversary, about how it was forgotten, and about the reminder on his phone. I didn't dramatize it. I stated it as fact. The room went very still. He tried to explain. Context appeared quickly. Habit, history, compartmentalization. None of it sounded malicious. All of it sounded practiced. I listened without reacting. Then I said the only thing that mattered. "This isn't about her," I said. "It's about where your attention goes when no one is asking for it." He looked like someone realizing a truth too late, not because it was hidden, but because he had never thought to look. I didn't ask him to change. I didn't issue ultimatums. I didn't negotiate terms. "I needed to tell you," I said, "because I'm done carrying this alone. What happens next depends on whether you can see the structure, not just feel the moment." There were no promises exchanged, no dramatic declarations, just quiet understanding and the weight of what couldn't be undone. I left the room that night feeling steady, not victorious, not devastated, complete. I didn't emerge from this as a different person. I emerged as myself, undiluted. For a long time, I thought growth meant becoming more accommodating, more patient, more emotionally flexible. I believed maturity was the ability to absorb discomfort without letting it change the shape of your life. What I understand now is that real growth often looks like subtraction. I no longer perform steadiness to earn security. I don't translate my needs into something easier for others to digest. I say less, but what I say lands. Not because it's sharp, but because it's true. The quiet dominance people sometimes notice in me now isn't something I cultivated intentionally. It's a byproduct of alignment. When your internal world and your external behavior stop contradicting each other, there's a natural authority that follows. I'm still kind, still thoughtful, still capable of deep empathy, but I'm no longer available for emotional labor that goes unrecognized and unreciprocated. I don't confuse endurance with love anymore. What changed most wasn't my relationship with him. It was my relationship with myself. I trust my perceptions now. I don't talk myself out of patterns I can clearly see. I don't ask for permission to be affected by what affects me. And because of that, my presence has weight. I don't rush to fill the silence. I let people reveal themselves in the space I no longer manage. I don't fear being misunderstood because I understand myself. Whether the relationship survived in its original form isn't the point of this story. The point is that I stopped negotiating my dignity in exchange for peace. There is grief in that, but there is also relief. I move through the world now with fewer explanations and firmer boundaries. Not because I've hardened, but because I've clarified, and clarity is quiet. There's a misconception that stories like this are about endings, about who leaves, who stays, who was right, who was wrong. But the truth is quieter and more enduring than that. This story is about recognition, about what happens when you stop explaining away the evidence of your own experience. When you stop mistaking consistency for care and endurance for love. When you finally accept that being needed is not the same as being chosen. I didn't reclaim myself through confrontation or cruelty. I didn't win anything. I didn't punish anyone. I simply stopped abandoning my own perception in order to preserve someone else's comfort. That's the moral I want to leave you with. People rarely wake up one day and decide to take you for granted. It happens gradually, especially when you're reliable, emotionally regulated, and capable of carrying more than your share without complaint. Over time, your effort becomes part of the background, noticed only when it disappears. And here's the difficult truth. Sometimes, the moment people realize your value is the same moment you no longer need them to. Not because you've hardened, but because you've returned to yourself. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about coherence. About living in a way that doesn't require constant self-editing. About letting consequences emerge naturally instead of preventing them at your own expense. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't owe infinite patience to people who benefit from your silence. You don't need to become louder to be taken seriously. And you don't have to justify stepping back from dynamics that require you to shrink. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining and start aligning. I'll leave you with a question I wish I had asked myself sooner. And I invite you to reflect on it in the comments if it resonates with you. At what point does staying understanding become a way of disappearing? And what might change if you chose clarity instead? Thank you for listening.